That meant that you had to contribute troops to such a venture, whether it was in your interest to do so or not, whether you had a stake in that fight or not. Suffice it to say, the United States did not take on the role of global hegemon at the end of World War I. And many argue that the reason that the consequence of that decision was a continued state of instability. A continued state of instability that resulted, on the one hand, in economic instability, the Great Depression, and closely associated with that, conflict. In the absence of a clear hegemon and economic stability, you got World War II. At the end of World War II, the government of Franklin Delano Roosevelt opted, once again, to push forward that project first articulated by Woodrow Wilson, but in slightly changed form. On an economic front, he very ambitiously created those basic institutions that I spoke about just a minute ago. But in addition to that, he also created the United Nations, in which likewise the United States and its allies played the dominant role. The one major problem with the United Nations was that indeed the United States and its allies played and were designed to play the dominant role. But who were the United States and its allies? Well, the San Francisco Treaty that created the United Nations took place before the end of the Second World War. And who were the alliances, were in that alliance at that point?
The Soviet Union.
Well, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. And at the time, the rosy assumption was that since they were the dominant alliance, that they would, for the most part, see eye to eye and be able to manage their global affairs fairly amiably. Of course, it didn't work out that way for the obvious reason that the Soviet Union didn't fit into that overall alliance very nicely. And consequently, the UN was, to a large extent, throughout the period of the Cold War, certainly a useful institution, continues to be a useful institution, certainly settled certain conflicts in an amiable way, certainly engaged in programs to promote development, to draw attention to human rights violations and things along those lines around the world, but was never able to settle conflicts that involved the key players in the international system. And those key players were predominantly the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. Economically, however, the United States became the clearly dominant force. And it was clearly the dominant force for a number of different reasons. First of all, in 1950, more than 50% of the steel produced on the planet was produced by the United States. More than 50% of the oil produced on the planet was produced in the United States. More than half of the financial resources of the planet were controlled by the United States. The United States was in a dominant position that it has never occupied since that time, far more so than it was at the end of the Cold War. Now, part of the reason for that dominance has to do not so much with the immense success of the United States, although the United States was immensely successful in stimulating its industries before and in particular during the Second World War, when the demand created by the war fueled the industries that the United States economy depended on, and the United States indeed supplied virtually everything that was required for the Allied victory, including much of the hardware used by the Soviet Union, was produced in the United States and brought to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. But that in and of itself wasn't sufficient to make the United States dominant. What was sufficient to create that kind of dominance, where over half of the resources of the planet were controlled by a country that represented only 5% of the world's population, was the utter destruction of practically every other country on the planet. including, of course, most notably, the main competitors to the United States, Germany, and to a slightly lesser extent, Japan by that point. And even Britain and France suffered extensively through that, but Britain and France by that point were no longer as dominant of players as France and Japan, as Germany and Japan had become in the period leading up to the Second World War. The Soviet Union had become a militarily dominant player, but economically was ravaged by the Second World War. It had lost 25 million people in the Second World War and lost a great deal of its most productive regions during that war in terms of its industrial heartland and so on. The United States was clearly dominant. And thus, the period of Pax Britannica, as the 19th century is often referred to, when Great Britain was dominant, was replaced by a Pax Americana of sorts during the Cold War. Now, the question is, to some extent, why do countries like the United States or Great Britain become hegemonic actors in the international system? At least part of the argument made by those that support hegemonic stability theory is that a considerable proportion of that is altruism. Certainly, the hegemonic power benefits by open free trade, and it would not engage in it if it did not benefit from it. But in creating that open trading system, it takes on costs that benefit not just itself, but everyone else that participates in it as well. Thus, the idea of it being a public good from which everyone can benefit, but for which not everyone pays the same price or makes the same kind of contribution, either in absolute or relative terms. In other words, there are always free riders, and there are always states that are tempted to be free riders, to take advantage of that order without having to pay that actual price, to take advantage of access to world markets for their exports without opening their own market up for imports from other parts of the world, and so on. Others have argued that this is not really the case, that states are never inherently altruistic. They are always self-interested. And certainly this is not something that should be new to realists that essentially argue precisely that. Why did the United States become the global hegemon after the Second World War? Well, certainly Marxists would argue that the reason why they did so has everything to do with their own self-interest and very little to do with altruism. A good place to investigate those basic claims and to think about those basic claims are those pieces of evidence that some point to as evidence of altruism, and to see whether that altruism is as altruistic as it at first appears to be. A good starting point in that regard was, can anyone think of something that qualifies as altruism in American foreign policy in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War?
The Marshall Plan in 1947.
The Marshall Plan in 1947. That was exactly what I was thinking of. The Marshall Plan essentially amounted to the granting of enormous amounts of credit by the United States to the countries of Western Europe in order to facilitate their rapid reconstruction. And many argue, well, this quite clearly is a case of altruism. The United States funneled enormous amounts of credit into countries that it previously competed with, and that as they indeed recovered from the damage suffered during the Second World War, eventually became competitors of the United States once again. So how could this possibly have been the self-interest of the United States? Others argue that there was not really a heck of a lot of altruism in the Marshall Plan. The rapid reconstruction of Western Europe was in the interests of the United States, not because the United States liked to be nice to its European neighbors, but because in the absence of the rapid reconstruction of Western Europe in all likelihood would go communist. In essence, if there were thousands upon thousands of people unemployed or underemployed, and incomes went way down in Western Europe, as all things being equal, they certainly would have. Nothing could have created more ripe atmosphere for Soviet subversion of Western Europe than those kinds of conditions. Meaning that the reason why the United States invested in the Marshall Plan was essentially because it was a crucial component of the Cold War. And the Cold War was a political and military competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. The greater threat of the Soviet Union essentially meant that whatever threat competition from Western Europe might have posed for American industries was minor compared to the threat that was posed by the Soviet Union. Furthermore, many argue that policymakers in the United States were crucially afraid at the end of the Second World War that the end of the war would plunge the United States back into the Great Depression. And there's good reason to think that. Essentially, the Great Depression was a period of rapid deflation in the United States, as well as elsewhere in the world. Rapid deflation meaning prices were dropping like stones. Now, for most of us thinking about our current experience, how could that be bad? Prices dropping. What could be better? Don't buy anything today, tomorrow it'll be cheaper. Well, for consumers, that certainly is not a bad idea, but most of us who are consumers are also, at some level or another, producers of something. And if we're producing something, and especially if we're a big corporation that's producing goods, one of the problems that we run into is that we don't have enough markets. Indeed, that's what results in deflation. Essentially, this is what many Marxists point to during the Great Depression, is that they argued that the Great Depression signaled that the system of capitalism was essentially being torn down by the seeds of its own destruction, by planting the seeds of its own destruction. And the seeds of its own destruction were its enormous gains in productivity that allowed it to produce more and more goods with less and less labor. And given that it was using less and less labor, there was less and less income going to people that could consume those goods. And that meant there were more and more goods being cranked out at one end, and fewer people that could afford to buy them. And as prices are regulated by demand and supply, that meant that prices started dropping. Now, why is that a problem? Well, big manufacturers, like automobile manufacturers, for example. Well, to just cite one example, the Ford Motor Company, when it came out with the Ford Mustang, made the decision to come out with the Ford Mustang, which came out in 1964, back in the mid-1950s, when their marketing and research and development team determined that there was a market niche of mid-sized cars in the United States that was not being fulfilled by producers of small sports cars or by producers of big family sedans, and that they could take advantage of this. And they designed the vehicle, and they created factories with precise machinery solely dedicated to producing that vehicle. And it took from the time that they made the first decisions in the late 1950s until 1964 for that thing to roll off the factory floor. That means that they had to decide whether it was profitable to make that investment, that enormous investment in creating that vehicle, on the basis of figures that were available in 1950. And they might have concluded that it was highly profitable, but what if by 1964 the price that they could get for that good was half of what they thought they could get when they made the investment decision? Well, it means that they can't recover the cost of their investments. And if they can't recover the cost of their investment, they go broke. And essentially that's what was happening during the Great Depression. Prices were dropping. And since capitalists make investment decisions, in many cases years before the product is actually on the market, and those costs can be recovered, if the prices are lower by that point than they are when the investment decision is made, they're losing money. And if they're losing money, they can't stay in business long. And if they go out of business, more people are unemployed. And if more people are unemployed, the market goes even further south. And you get into a kind of a death spiral of deflation, which is self-reinforcing. The United States got out of that in part because of the New Deal. And the New Deal essentially pumped money into the economy. simply by printing money and hiring people to build streets, hiring people to build dams, hiring people to educate others. It also created more demand by legalizing labor unions, which were able to press up wages, by imposing a minimum wage, which likewise pushed up wages, and by doing so created some demand, and thus tried to get the ball rolling again. In doing that, they were largely imitating what they were observing the Nazis doing in Germany. The Nazis did precisely the same thing, but much more effectively, much more radically, and thus were out of the Depression by 1934, when the United States was still in the depth of depression. What ultimately rescued the United States from the Depression was the Second World War, and the demand for American industrial goods that it created, not in the United States itself, but in Great Britain and France and so on, among the Allied forces that were fighting against the Nazi Germany. That's what rescued American corporations. And thus, the fear was that the war is over, that demand dries up, the Europeans can't buy anything from us anyway, but in the meantime, our corporations can't function just on the small market that exists within the United States. They have to have demand globally, and therefore we have to stimulate that demand globally. And that means essentially that if we could go back to the Marshall Plan, to a large extent, the Marshall Plan was certainly beneficial to the Europeans, certainly looked like a nice plan, but it was certainly not something that was altruistic. It was something that was done by the United States out of self-interest. The fact that it was done in self-interest doesn't necessarily mean, however, that the United States will be in a position to continue to do so, or will be inclined to continue to do so. In essence, the core of hegemonic stability theory is that no power can ever remain hegemonic forever. That there will always be cycles of a particular state becoming hegemonic and then declining. Declining because their economic position declines, and their economic position declines in part because they're taking on greater costs to maintain that overall system than all of the other countries that benefit from it. They have to maintain military superiority, and militaries cost a lot of money. And their allies, in the case of Britain and so on, are not inclined to spend a great deal on military. Why should they? They've got the protection of the Great British, of the British Empire, and insofar as they spend money on the military, who are they protecting themselves from? They can't protect themselves from the hegemon itself. Their military superiority is way over the top, and they don't need to protect themselves from anyone else because the British will come to their defense. And the same thing is to some extent true of the United States. The United States, when it stepped in that role at the end of the Second World War, became the hegemonic military power as well as economic power. And part and parcel of that is that it allowed a whole slew of other countries in the international system to free ride on those benefits. The most explicit of those free riders was Japan. Now, Japan, we shouldn't be too derogatory in this regard, because the Japanese were not naturally inclined to become free riders, or were not naturally inclined to be freeloaders on the good graces of the United States, but were actually forced by the United States to remain free riders, meaning that the United States basically wrote the Constitution for the current Japanese state, and part of the constitutional requirements of that Constitution is that Japan not spend more than 2% on its military. In other words, cannot spend more than is basically required for them to protect their borders, but not enough so that they can actually project power outside of their borders. So they were kind of forced into that free rider status. Germany somewhat less so, but nonetheless similar kind of picture. And the Europeans in general likewise spent far less as a percentage of their GDP on the military than the United States did. And the reasons are obvious. If the only threat facing Japan or Germany or France was the Soviet Union, why should Germany or Japan or France or Britain spend a lot of money trying to defend themselves against the Soviet Union if the United States is going to come to their defense anyway, and has to come to their defense in order to protect themselves in the long run? Well, that means that the United States bears more expenses. And as it bears more expenses, it has to tax their economy at a higher rate than their competitors. And as it taxes them at a higher rate, the rate of investment in their domestic economy slows down. And that means that the others will start to catch up. And ultimately, that the United States, in this case, will decline. Now, many have been arguing that the United States began that decline in the 1970s. In essence, prior to the 1970s, the United States had, throughout the previous century more or less, consistently had a balance of trade surplus, meaning they were exporting more than they were importing. That began to change in the 1970s. It began to change in the 1970s for a whole slew of complex reasons, but chief among them was that economies that previously couldn't compete with the United States were suddenly back in the game. Here I'm obviously talking about Japan and Germany. So the auto industry in the United States was without real competitors throughout the 1950s and 60s. Starting in the 1970s, it had competitors. It got a little worse. One of the things that got worse is that the United States, in part because of the inflexibility of economic systems as a whole, adjusted very nicely to the domestic market in the United States. But that domestic market was atypical of the markets of the rest of the world. One thing that was atypical was that in the United States, fuel costs were extremely low. And that meant, as most of you are probably aware, that the Americans were cranking out enormous gas-guzzling vehicles. And at 25 cents a gallon, which was the price of gasoline during most of the 1960s, why wouldn't you want to buy a huge Cadillac with a V8 engine that gets less than 10 miles to the gallon? Made no difference, 25 cents a gallon, who cares? Well, all of a sudden, in 1972, the first oil shocks hit and pushed double the price of oil. And by the late 70s, a second round hit that did the same thing once again. And suddenly, these American behemoths were competing with Japanese vehicles, where fuel had always been very expensive, and German vehicles, where fuel had always been very expensive. Cars that were much smaller, that were much more fuel efficient, and that suddenly became pretty attractive in American markets, and started to compete with the American products. So again, to a certain extent, the United States became undermined by what allowed them to succeed to begin with. Another component of that is that the United States, of course, bore the brunt of the expense of the Cold War in terms of armaments, but also in terms of international engagements. And as much as we might think, and are probably quite right in thinking that the Vietnam War was a stupid debacle, was in hindsight a completely irrational move, and a waste of enormous resources by the United States for something that ultimately was not of any significance in the international system. At the time that the United States made the decision to go into Vietnam, American leaders were convinced that it was absolutely crucial to the defense of the free world, of that global hegemonic position of the United States. And therefore, the United States bore the brunt of those expenses. No one else kicked in anything. And that was a sharp difference, for example, from the Korean War, where the Korean War was, again, dominated by the United States, but was fought under UN flags and had contributors from Canada, from Britain, from France, from Germany, from all of the free world, so to speak. By the time of Vietnam, the French had lost interest in Vietnam. They had gotten their butt kicked there once already and were not about to go back in. The British didn't perceive any interest there. The Germans didn't. The Canadian government didn't even go along with the Americans. The Americans were on their own. And essentially, the Vietnam War bankrupted the United States. By 1973, Nixon had no choice but to institute what became known as the Nixon shocks. And the Nixon shock, the main Nixon shock, was that the United States announced that the dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. And that sent shockwaves through the international system. And was one of the signals of U.S. decline. Now, U.S. decline, of course, was to some extent overblown. The U.S. remained a dominant player, remains a dominant player to this day. And that has, in turn, unleashed a considerable amount of debate about the nature of hegemonic forces, hegemonic states, and their longevity. In particular, it begs the question, does the decline of a hegemonic power always mean the decline of that liberal, trade system, of that open world market? Or can the institutions that have been created by that hegemon be maintained by the lesser powers that are starting to eclipse the hegemonic power, but that nonetheless benefit from it? And the fact that the basic trade system, the basic Bretton Woods system, although substantially altered by the Nixon shocks and subsequent developments, stayed to a large extent in place. And many observers argue that that is a good indication that while a hegemon is necessary to create such a system to begin with, it doesn't need to remain hegemonic forever for that system to remain stable, so long as enough others benefit from it that they're willing to increasingly play the role of maintaining it. The same thing has been argued with regard to the British hegemonic system. As I pointed out,